The overwhelming likelihood is that we are heading towards a plague on both their houses' election and a reform government. What, short of resigning, can Starmer now do to save himself and to save Labour? I don't think I can ever remember a Prime Minister using the kind of language that Keir Starmer used about Peter Mandelson with a colleague ever before. He was clearly absolutely livid. But there's an issue of values here, is there not? Because Peter Mandelson has always been attracted to the rich, the corporate and all the rest of it, particularly the tech companies in recent years through his own company, Global Counsel. And I think a lot of MPs are saying, in the end, his values just do not align with the Labour government. Even if he would feel comfortable in Trump's Washington, it was a terrible error.
There's an interesting thing, I think, about Labour MPs muddling up Peter Mandelson, the sort of man with those values. You know, he talked about being supremely relaxed about the filthy rich. That's a very strange thing to say, actually. But then muddling that up with the sort of new Labour Blairite values, if you like. Some people want to associate the two. And I think what's quite important now when it comes to the sort of Labour leadership is to differentiate those two things. So the sort of slightly grubby Mandelsonian love of lucre and wealth and sort of glamour and power with those sort of election-winning strategy of understanding business. There's
you're saying don't trash
things.
New Labour as a brand entirely because of what's happened this week, recently.
Yeah, I mean, I think also just in terms of the sort of the political necessity of winning, I can totally understand why Peter Mandelson was somebody who Starmer really wanted to hear from. And again, we're talking about a world that is far from ideal in terms of President Trump and how to connect with him, somebody who also has a love of the things that are glittering. And I can see why, if you were thinking entirely pragmatically, Peter Mandelson would be a choice there. But at the same time, you do have to, take a step back and say, are there some red flags here that we might want to investigate, as opposed to thinking, but this is the guy, this is the only possible option we could have.
And of course, remember that Peter Mandelson knew he had forwarded these emails to Jeffrey Epstein, which containing apparently market-sensitive information, all the things that the police are now investigating. He knew that when he applied for the job and when he went through the vetting process, even if the Prime Minister didn't. So that is the sort of peculiar thing, that he had that sort of ability to take that risk even at that level.
Has Keir Starmer lost the backbenches, do you think?
I think there is a swelling opinion of real discontent with the Prime Minister and his decision-making and his misjudgments.
And in a sense, none of that means a row of beans unless there are people who might take over from him, behind whom people are rallying. Do you see people rallying at the moment behind an alternative Prime Minister?
I don't see anything at the moment. I would say that there has been one or two parliamentary colleagues that has, they would say in media circles, been on manoeuvres for quite some time and probably just waiting for their time that they feel is right to strike.
Andy Burnham's not going to get his chance this time round. Do you have anybody in the Commons that you look to and think that's the kind of leader that I would like next?
Not at the moment, quite frankly, Andrew. No, I think it's a case of watch this space. But what I will say is, to be preemptive of any potential leadership battle that might be coming down the line and will be coming down the line, I think Labour Party members have got to be wary of false gods, the sort of people that will present themselves as being the new Nye Bevan or the new Tony Benn, because whenever we have seen internal Labour Party elections, candidates always try and play to the left of the party. I'm old enough to remember the 10 leadership pledges that Keir Starmer made, and none of them have came to fruition.
We're both old enough to know that we can't predict what's going to happen in politics ever. But when do you think the most dangerous moment for Keir Starmer now is?
I think Keir Starmer is living it right now.
Right now, even before the May elections.
I think we've seen a very poor performance yesterday at PMQs. We can see a lot of internal discontent within the Parliamentary Labour Party, and we can also as well see very, very poor approval ratings throughout the country.
How much trouble do we think that Keir Starmer's in? I said yesterday I thought it was the final stages of his government. What do you think?
I think that's right. I think what we don't know from talking to MPs and ministers today and advisors is when or how the end will come. So I think Absolutely. It is the end game. Whether that's weeks or months, I think is unclear. I think it's very hard to see him surviving until the next election, certainly. It's quite hard to see him surviving beyond the local elections in May, but it's a little unclear exactly how the end comes.
Yes, I can remember, we can both remember, I'm sure, Isabel, the final stage of the Theresa May government. And that went on and on and on, long after we thought she's done.
Yeah. Yeah, and it can really limp on to the detriment of the country, because you can't do any ambitious policy making or answer the big questions that our country is facing. And indeed, Starmer hasn't been able to do that for quite a while anyway. He's shelved a second iteration of welfare reform, having completely messed up the first go. So it's not as if he's going to keep going in any sort of real sense where he's going to do anything. It's just a sort of in office but not in power problem. But I do think, I totally agree with Rachel, that the ministers who would never want to lean into this kind of psychodrama have been saying, a long time actually before the latest Mandelson scandal broke, that it's a question of when, not if, and that they have to get rid of Starmer. And these are not the kind of people who are mouthing off on the airwaves. These are people who would like to be doing their job but just feel they now can't.
Everyone needs a sense of direction, not necessarily a full-blown philosophy, but a clear sense of direction. And there is a real danger, I think a lot of people say to me, of a zombie government.
I was talking to one cabinet minister the other day who said it's like we've got the tech guy in charge, and you need somebody who's much more of an architect and a sort of designer to really give a sense of where they're taking the country. What kind of country do you want to build? It was interesting, actually. I was in China last week with Starmer, and that international stage, he was brilliant. The business leaders around him were really impressed. They all kept saying, why don't we see this back in
and they love
Britain?
him. He loves that part of the job, I think.
But it's only part of the job. That's the
part of the job, exactly. Never hear Keir and all of that. On the other hand, saying that Keir Starmer's on his way out is meaningless unless somebody is trying to push their way in. And at this stage, it's very hard to see where that pressure is going to come from.
I mean, there's certainly plenty of people who would like to push their way in, but they'd like somebody else to do the pushing, and then they sort of walk through the open doors. There's obviously, Angela Rayner, who is not dead yet and has been making some very well-timed and crafted interventions over the past few days on the disclosure of the documents around Mandelson. There's Wes Streeting, there's Al Carnes, who's now being talked of as well.
He's busy in Norway with an ice pick at the moment, I think. just going up a mountain, not hitting anyone with it. Yeah.
Might bring it home with him, though.
Yeah, indeed.
But actually, when you think about those individuals, Angela Rayner still has the unresolved question of her tax investigation by the HMRC.
Isn't it interesting? It's taking quite so long.
I mean, it's a fully independent thing. Nobody knows when it's going to happen. But Wes Streeting, some MPs are saying is damaged by he was at the sort of Roger Liddell, Peter Mandelson dinners, some of them. So it's not as easy or straightforward for any of the potential rivals as they might hope.
Have you noticed the nearer somebody is to Peter Mandelson, the more sulphuric and furious the language about him now is?
Well, everyone's desperately trying to distance themselves. Yeah,
I think it's also sort of a modern thing anyway, that often there will be these scandals in plain sight. We knew that Mandelson was friends with Epstein. People sort of tolerate it to a point, and then there's one piece of information that sort of tips it over, and everyone is desperate to say, I hated him, exile him to some island, and they sort of overcompensate in catching up with the rage that perhaps they should have felt a little bit earlier.
Let me ask you about the big picture here, which is clearly the country has been obsessed by the Mandelson story. We know that people have been watching it and following it very, very closely indeed. And the level of anger and disgust is quite serious. But I kind of think, although Kemi Badenoch had a very good week, people haven't forgotten the problems the Conservatives had as well. And therefore, I suspect we are heading further in the reform direction. There is this kind of plague on both your houses, mood in the country. What do you both think?
Well, I think the problem is that this story just plays into that all politicians are the same. One rule for them, another rule for the rest of us. It's exactly the same mood as we had after the Partygate scandals during the Boris Johnson years. And it's that sense that politicians are just detached from the real world. And this, ironically, I think Keir Starmer wasn't part of that sort of Mandelsonian set. He isn't in that sort of glittering
No, he never
circle.
has been.
Wouldn't have been seen dead at a Jeffrey Epstein, Island or Lolita Express or whatever. But he too has been associated. He was being promised something different. He was going to tread more lightly on our lives. And that hasn't happened. And I think so, therefore, it's the anti-politics mood that is the beneficiary.
So does that mean that if he goes and somebody else takes over, that somebody else will very quickly become a national hate figure as well?
Well, I mean, I think the party really needs to think about who could take over, who would be good at tackling reform. But I think they also need to think about what they stand for as a party, because to me, the problem with Keir Starmer is the problem with the Labour Party. And that's that it knows it wants to identify with voters' concerns. It doesn't necessarily agree with all of them. It's very ill at ease still talking about immigration, for instance. And, Starmer spent months apologising for a speech that came out of his own mouth. So it needs to work out what it stands for.
Absolutely. As I said yesterday, I also think the Prime Minister is a decent person who entered public life for the right reasons. Being lied to is not a capital offence. But naivety, when your Prime Minister, is pretty serious. Let's be clear. The country is freshly disgusted by the Mandelson affair, doesn't want to listen to Starmer, and the country remains disgusted by the way the Tories behaved when they were in power. And so today, the obvious conclusion, the overwhelming likelihood, is that we are heading towards a plague on both their houses' election and a reform government. What, short of resigning, can Starmer now do to save himself and to save Labour? Well, he must stop disdaining politics and start to think harder about what real politics means. Example, he said today he wanted the country to be fairer, safer and more secure. But the politics of Peter Mandelson, who he now regards as the viper he took to his bosom, is all about the interests of the super rich, the corporate bankers, the big American tech companies digging themselves ever deeper into our public life. It wasn't New Labour or Blue Labour or Old Labour. It was anti-Labour. The Mandelson affair wasn't just about one guy making a mistake about another guy. It was about the arrogance and the entitlement of the privileged them and these days the increasingly furious us. And that is why, even though Epstein was deeply involved in the far right across Europe and the Russians, populism has not yet been set back by this affair. It may be unfair, but Nigel Farage remains in a very strong position, and we are heading for wild political upsets. And it's not just about one man's greed or lies, as the Prime Minister suggested today. It's about profound social unfairness. It's time, as somebody said once, to get back to basics. But is it even possible these days to take on the biggest corporate interests? Well, this week, the Spanish Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, said he would ban social media for children, calling it a place of addiction, abuse, pornography, manipulation and violence. Elon Musk responded almost immediately, "Dirty Sanchez is a tyrant and a traitor to the people of Spain." Taking on the big guys means being ready for some proper fights.